In these tubes, stored in liquid nitrogen, are scores of fertilized human eggs. Implanted into a woman's womb, they would grow into babies. But now, scientists have a new use for them. They can use them to produce thousands of human cells, which could be used to treat a whole range of human diseases. As a fertilized egg develops, it multiplies into thousands of cells. American scientists have removed some of these cells, called stem cells, and persuaded them to continue dividing month after month, forming not an embryo, but blobs of unspecialized cells. The stem cells are capable of forming any tissue in the body, like muscle or bone or nerve tissue. Scientists believe one day the cells could be used to repair diseased hearts or spinal cord injuries, or even eventually be used to grow whole new organs for transplant. But there are ethical questions about the research. There are fears it could lead to cloning of humans. The company which paid for the research denies that's going to happen.
We would not support the effort to use any of this research to do cloning with the intent to produce a human child, or to inject these cells into another developing embryo in order to create a human being that has this mixed genetic composition.
But despite the reassurances, some people believe it's basically wrong to manipulate human fertilized egg cells simply to use them as a source of spare parts. James Wilkinson, BBC News.
Well, the fertility expert, Lord Winston, joins us from Hammersmith Hospital, and in our Birmingham studio is Peter Garrett, who's Research Director of the pro-life charity Life. Lord Winston, first of all, we are talking, are we, about enormous potential benefits for people who have diseases that at the moment we can't cure?
Diseases and accidents and a whole range of other conditions. For example, on this morning's news, there's a boy who's got 95% burns, and he could be treated with skin which would not be rejected as a result of getting cells from a fertilized egg.
Mr. Garrett,
in the future.
If that is the case, Mr. Garrett, what is your case against it happening?
Well, it's not just a question of evaluating the potential benefits, it's also a question of crafting a science which is put at the service of man. And I think the outlandish arrangements that are currently being proposed suggest that we have forgotten completely about the ethical constraints that normally bind science. The child from which the cells has been taken has been left out of account, and I profoundly believe that we're going to see this technique spliced with the cloning techniques that were used to produce Dolly, so that a new generation of tissue-compatible organs can now be produced for people.
Let us put that to Lord Winston. Lord Winston, how should we regard the fertilized embryo from which these cells are being taken? Referred there to as a child, well, is that the right way to regard it?
Mr. Garrett may call himself a research director, but he should realize, if he'd done his research properly, it would be possible to take cells from a fertilized egg without damaging that fertilized egg. We've done that at Hammersmith Hospital over many years, and so there is a possibility of the embryo being completely inviolate as a result. This is a marvelous development. It's one that will protect and enhance human life, and it surely would be unethical not to do it. Of course, nobody wants to see cloning, and nobody has suggested that cloning would come out of this. So I don't think there's any serious risk of cloning being at issue. That's a red herring.
Mr. Garrett?
I would approve of this technique if the cells can be taken without damaging the embryo. But I think Lord Winston is being economical with the truth to say that there's no intention to do so-called therapeutic cloning. Last night we saw Professor Gosden on Newsnight expressing the concerns of the HGAC, the new committee looking at cloning. And it's very clear that people regard the potential breakthrough this week as being linkable with the cloning technologies. And Professor Winston regards himself as a professor of fertility studies, but he must be aware that these two technologies can be brought together to provide something powerful but ethically repugnant.
The point, Lord Winston, surely is that what worries people is that this is a slippery slope, and that with every passing year science enables us to do more and the scientists persuade us to do more, and perhaps we should pause at this point, this important point, and think more about what we're doing.
Well, I think we think a great deal about what we're doing, and I think it's really rather offensive to suggest we don't think extremely carefully. I would say, yes, there is a slope, but it's a slope upwards. What technology is doing in this area is improving and enhancing life already. 8 years ago, had it not been for the work that's gone on, we would not have been able to prevent a genetic disease. Had it been left to people like Mr. Garrett, there are many healthy children now walking around on the face of the earth that would not have existed. surely one has to understand that. There is a large consensus of opinion in this country which supports that work. Nobody wants to impose their views on Mr. Garrett, but Mr. Garrett should not choose to impose his views on others who've decided that this work is to the benefit of life.
Isn't that the point, Mr. Garrett, that we become used to these things, and when we become used to them, we also accept that they have huge benefits, as this research may well provide, and in that case, public opinion is going to be with Lord Winston and not with you.
The reason Lord Winston's so irate is that a devastating documentary on Tuesday pulled the wool away from the eyes of the public, and they've begun to see some of the reprehensible things that are being pushed upon us in the name of science. It is clearly now the intention to combine this new breakthrough with human stem cells, with cloning technology, and we will see that the production of therapeutic clones is a stepping stone to the production of pregnancy cloning. Lord Winston can say what he wants, but that's the fact.
Peter Garrett and Lord Winston, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
It would be like having the best library in the world in our classrooms, said Tony Blair as he launched the project to link all schools in Britain to the internet. The Prime Minister announced that £700 million of local and central government money will go into what's being called the National Grid for Learning.
Year 6 at Trimdon Village Junior School in County Durham can now research libraries and archives from all over the world thanks to their internet access via the National Grid for Learning. This morning they were joined by the Prime Minister to launch the grid nationwide and announce more investment in school computers. This is what the pupils at Trimdon Junior School are looking at on the National Grid for Learning. These details of their village in the 19th century are on the website of the Public Records Office. It means the pupils can study them without having to go through the 600-mile round trip to London. The National Grid for Learning will give schools access to online information from museums and libraries, allow pupils to take part remotely in scientific experiments, and allow teachers to exchange lesson ideas and teaching materials.
This is the technology of the future. If our children aren't able to use it, then they're not going to get as good a job and as good prospects in the future, and it will help them to do basic numeracy and literacy.
Selected schools in Scotland and in England and Wales have been piloting the National Grid for the past year. Elsewhere, though, schools lack the equipment and trained staff to use the internet fully, and some teachers fear computers could undermine basic education.
It's very important for youngsters to become computer literate, but you don't become computer literate without appreciating the basics first, and you have to become literate first, and then you can learn how to use the computer.
They don't spend all day, every day on the internet. They still do reading, they still do numeracy as they would normally do. But the National Grid for Learning also has activities to help the National Literacy Hour so that they can continue to learn literacy and numeracy.
The government has now appealed to the computer industry to help achieve its aim of getting all British schools connected to the National Grid for Learning by 2002. Mike Baker, BBC News.
The government's plans to encourage people on lower incomes to put money away have been criticised as those court-martialed say many of them were actually suffering from battlefield stress, a condition then not fully understood.
The annual Remembrance Day service honouring the nation's war dead will have a special poignancy this year for the surviving old soldiers of the First World War, whose numbers grow less every year. This year is the 80th anniversary of the ending of that war. Tomorrow, on the eve of the main service, families of soldiers executed during that conflict will hold their own ceremony for their loved ones at the cenotaph. Some 300 British and Commonwealth servicemen were shot for cowardice, desertion or disobeying orders. Their families have long campaigned for an independent inquiry into their fate, arguing they were traumatised and shell-shocked by conditions in the trenches. Earlier this year, the Ministry of Defence expressed regret at the way the men were treated, but said they wouldn't receive posthumous pardons. Harry Farr, a private with the West Yorkshire Regiment, was known to have suffered from shell shock when he was executed.
All we're asking for is a posthumous pardon for the soldiers, especially those that were proved that they were really ill, which happened in the case of my father.
Tomorrow's service will be short and low-key, with wreaths laid in memory of the men whose military service ended in disgrace, but whose families regard them as victims of war. June Kelly, BBC News.
And at 27 minutes past 1, time for the main news again. There are calls for more